Good morning, Westside.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for being here today. I appreciate your presence and hope this Sunday is a good one for you. I especially like potluck Sundays, and even more the Sundays when we welcome new members to our congregation. Today is a good day. This is also my next to last reflection before going away on sabbatical. I suppose, depending upon your perspective, I'll either be gone for a long time or not long enough. But either way, I will be gone for a while, for 6 months after next Sunday. If you're able, I hope you'll consider attending next week too, as I have a few favors I'd like to ask of you as the minister of this church while I'm away. Ministers, I guess, like some other professions, can have reputations that are less than flattering. Ministers can have the reputation of taking money from those who trust them. You read about ministers who have had inappropriate relations with people they supposedly serve. Ministers are sometimes known to be poor losers, and in other traditions, attempt to get their way because they obviously have God on their side. But I guess the one you hear most often is that of the minister who is a blowhard. Most often of male ministers who like to hear themselves talk. Perhaps loving the sound of their own voice, they give long-winded sermons that go on and on. One minister, known for his lengthy sermons, noticed a man get up and leave during the middle of his message. The man returned just before the conclusion of the service. Afterwards, the minister asked the man where he had gone, and he said, "I went to get a haircut." "But," said the minister, "why didn't you go before the service?" And the man says, "Because I didn't need one then." I certainly have some reflections that are better than others over the years. I do my best to offer reflections that are interesting and thought-provoking, that remind us of what we have accomplished, but that there is also much yet to do. But I will tell you that lately, I have spent much of my time wondering about humanity. I wonder how we can be so inconsiderate, how we can be so mean and callous, how we can continue to mess things up instead of making improvements to life. There are times, I will readily admit to you, where I get caught up in thinking that all is lost, that there is little hope, and that we are all doomed. And I can get stuck in that place. I think the media has something to do with this. We most often see on the television and hear on the radio the stories which are most unpleasant and which remind us of the bad governments, the bad state of affairs, and of the bad individuals. But there is a saying with which you are likely familiar that was popularized by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's easily remembered, it is beautiful, it is filled with hope." And I love to think that although the arc of the moral universe is long, that it does bend towards justice. You can hear of the arc more often when you're listening for it, and you can see it more often if you are looking for it. I do listen for the arc, and I do look for it because I need to believe that it's true. In my mind, it is important for me to believe things are getting better, that we're not stuck with the mentality of yesterday, and that tomorrow holds more promise. I understand this is perhaps a need of my own creation, that I have created this need to see humanity as improving, as continuing to evolve in a positive manner. And yet, even with this knowledge, I look for instances to prove what King said to be correct. That things are, that we are, in fact, getting better. Many of you in this room will know this, but King's quote came from one of our Unitarian ancestors, the Reverend Theodore Parker. King flirted with the idea of becoming Unitarian, so likely read many of Parker's ideas. Coretta Scott attended Unitarian churches many times before she ever met Martin. They ultimately decided to stay within their Baptist tradition, as you well know, but here are the words Parker used in a book of his published in 1853. He said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eyes reach but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I can see, I am sure it bends towards justice." This is the same man who influenced Abraham Lincoln with his words when talking about government. It was Parker who said, "This idea demands, as the proximate organization thereof, a democracy that is a government of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people." But this idea coming from Parker and King is powerful. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it tends towards justice. It implies that we are getting better. And when I stop to think about it, I do believe this is correct, despite what oftentimes seems to be evidence to the contrary. I will get caught up in the staggering amount of bad stuff going on in the world. There are atrocities of natural disaster, and there are those we human beings have created ourselves. But when we step back and we look for the ark, we will find examples of goodness. In just one example, 10 years ago, I would not have thought there would be 7 of our 50 United States to recognize marriage between 2 women or 2 men. Much less that one of those states would be Iowa. While I was disappointed the New Jersey governor did not allow his state to cross the threshold this past week, there is still hope in that state, and there is now great hope that Maryland will soon acknowledge the right. In 1996, only 1/4 of the people in the United States favored marriage equality. Support has since doubled in a relatively short period of time. I have little doubt today that if I live to be the average age males tend to live in the United States, I will see marriage equality in all 50 states sooner, probably, rather than later. We can also look back in the past at how we used to treat different racial and ethnic groups. We can see how women were treated and dismissed. We can see the hatred of immigrants, of GLBT folks. Our country's history is unfortunately replete with examples of times where we today look back and ask, what were our ancestors thinking? How could they have been so blind, so ignorant, so hateful? And this thankfully can remind me, it can remind us that though the arc of the moral universe may be long, it does bend towards justice. It can remind us that we are getting better. I've been reading a book titled The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. It's a large, well over 800 pages large book, so it takes some time to get through. But it is one of the most hopeful books I have read in a long time. It is written by someone many of you will recognize, Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is a professor at Harvard. He's written numerous books and articles. He taught at MIT and Stanford before returning to teach at Harvard, where he had gone to graduate school to study experimental psychology. In his rather large book, Pinker gives page after page of examples of how people and nations used to behave in comparison to how we behave today. In each of his examples, he shows us how we are getting better. And if you ever want to read something that proclaims the arc of the moral universe, I would recommend to you The Better Angels of Our Nature. In one part of the book, he speaks of the culture of honor. This culture used to be very prevalent in the United States. In fact, when you look at dueling, calling someone out with pistols in order to retain or reinstate one's honor, you are seeing the culture in its full force. Even people of high political office, even founders of the United States, like the man pictured on your $10 bill, would duel and be killed over honor. The closest thing we have today, says Pinker, is when a vice president accidentally shoots someone in the face. Yet you might be interested to know that same former vice president reportedly lobbied several lawmakers in Maryland recently in favor of marriage equality. Now that is a sign we're getting better. But the remnants of the culture of honor are still found in southern states and in Texas, where you will find more physical violence, and in gangs throughout the United States and the world. I don't know if any of you watch Frontline, the wonderful program on PBS, but the most recent show was called The Interrupters. In it, you can easily see the culture of honor that occurs in gangs on the south side of Chicago. Today, former gang members attempt to interrupt the violence and in some ways shame those involved away from doing something they will later regret. This is very much the same way, Steven Pinker tells us, that dueling went out of style. People began to castigate, to shame individuals who participated in dueling. And interestingly, much more recently, this is the same way fox hunting in Great Britain came to an end, because working class people were unable to contain their contempt for this upper crust display of mean-spirited sport. So for the most part today, people do not use dueling pistols to defend their honor, and we do not usually like the odds when a bunch of rich white guys on horses with dogs gang up on a lone fox scrambling for her life. In some ways, it's reminiscent of the reflection on empathy I gave a couple of weeks ago. I was saying that when we are able to put ourselves in the shoes of another, we are much less likely to harm them, to ridicule them, to rain terror upon them. Even though we can find examples, because there are plenty of examples wherein children do not seem to be innately kind. I mean, there are years called the terrible twos for a reason. And even though we can easily find examples of adults who do not seem to be very empathic and who do some terrible things, the truth seems to be that the vast majority of people, the vast majority of time, wind up closer to you and me than to some tyrant or killer. Most of us, even those with whom we disagree on religious or political grounds, are good, are are empathic and are behaving in better ways than generations past. Yet we must also be vigilant. Because make no mistake about it, there is certainly more room for improvement. And I have no doubt whatsoever, there are things we do today where future generations will look back and ask, what were our ancestors thinking? How could they have been so blind, so ignorant, so hateful? So it's important to me that Unitarian Universalists, like we have done so many times in the past, extend our compassion as far as we possibly can. We have rarely been disappointed in the results of extending compassion. So be awake. Keep your eyes open. Keep your hearts open. And be alert to the possibilities of compassion. Let us not be stuck or complacent, but let us ask ourselves where we can be examples of goodness for future generations. How can we break new compassionate ground and lead by example with the full knowledge that it will not happen quickly enough? Yet we can take hope in the fact that the arc will continue to bend, and that it will bend towards justice. And we can take some comfort without being content that we are indeed getting better. As we rise in body or spirit and join in singing our closing hymn,